Electric Hoedown from Dweezil Zappa's debut solo album, Having a Bad Day. He's a talented son of Frank Zappa, also an actor, a philanthropist, and former MTV VJ. This year, Zappa's been playing his 50 Years of Frank tour with the band, and he's on the air with me. Welcome to Revenge of the 80s Radio, Dweezil.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you here, and thank you for coming on. You obviously inherited musical talent from your father, Dweezil, but what was it like growing up Zappa?
I think a lot of people expect that it would be so wild and crazy, but it really wasn't. I mean, our experience at home was what we considered normal. So my dad was in the studio working when he wasn't on tour, and things were pretty calm and regular at our house. We did have less restrictions on what kind of language you could use in the house. So some of our friends in the elementary school era days would be amazed at what you could say, and they would try it out at their own homes and find out that that wasn't acceptable. But my dad had always told us there's no word that you could use in the English language that would make you go to hell. So it's not that we were constantly using profanity, but if it made your point, then it was acceptable.
Well, over here it was use certain words and cigar in the eye, but different story for a different day.
Well, we really had a lot of creativity around, and the process of using creative thinking was inspired by quotes and things by my dad, like, without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible. That kind of stuff is it's motivational, and we often learn to use creative thinking for problem solving and all that kind of stuff. So it was a great environment to grow up in. And oftentimes people say, well, how would you rebel if you had all of that as your background? And I said, really, for me, the only way to rebel would have to become an accountant or a lawyer.
Dweezil Zappa is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Still born to a talented family or not, you still had to work to get there and gain that talent, become the respected guitar player you are. How did you develop your skills in your younger years?
Well, it's always important to learn a skill and to be motivated and excited about something in life. I happened to find the guitar at an early age and get really interested in it. So at 12 years old, I got inspired to learn to be as good as I could be on the guitar. And of course, my dad was one of my biggest influences. There were other guitarists that were very popular from that time frame, such as Edward Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. So this was around 1982, and the predominant music that was on the radio at that time was hard rock and metal music. And so me, and along with millions of other people roughly my age, were all inspired to pick up the guitar, and there became quite a guitar generation. But I always was practicing 8 or 9 or even 10 hours a day because I was that into it. And it just was a natural progression to make progress when you're practicing that much.
It seems you let the guitar do the talking, or at least in one song, maybe the killing, but that's another different story. What are your axes of choice?
The guitars that I like to play are chosen for the ease of use. There's a guitar called Gibson SG, and that one is the same guitar that my dad used a lot in the 70s. Angus Young is well known for playing a Gibson SG. That particular guitar, you have very easy access to the upper area of the guitar, so you can play the higher notes more easily. And that one really just became my favorite, especially if I have to play a lot of difficult music. My dad's complex melody lines that were written for other instruments like marimba or keyboards or things, that upper access is important for that. And I also just like the sound of that kind of guitar, but I also like the sound of a Stratocaster as well. So I use things that just work for the particular context of the song itself, but it is important that it plays with ease.
With the release of your first album, Having a Bad Day, you did keep with a lot of family tradition, the real, very alternative hard rock with expert musicianship, obviously, but with an outward appearance of not taking yourself too seriously. It's quite a mix, and I would say a true Zappa combo, but since there were a lot of expectations, how did you approach recording this debut album?
I didn't really have any thoughts about what people would think about it. I was just having fun working in the studio. My dad produced the record. That was the one time I got to make a record with him all the way through, and him producing and working on stuff. And I made that record when I was 15, so it was a great education to learn about the studio and how you get sounds and the process of recording and doing overdubs and all of those things that one needs to know about when they are in the music business.
15. Boy, when I was 15, I was just learning to play the keyboard, and that didn't work out too well either. We're taking a break from the music a little bit. When I was a teen, I was looking forward to seeing for the first time Richard Dawson play an evil adversary in a movie. He was always well known as the good guy, like on Hogan's Heroes, or the guy who got presents from Midwestern grandmas and Family Feud. So I'm headed to see The Running Man. And in the movie, playing one of the lead rebels is you, Dweezil. I was happy to see it because I was a fan of your work as a VJ and, of course, the music. How'd you land that part?
That was the Running Man film. They had auditions and things for different parts in the film, and that happened to be something that I was asked to audition for and got the part for Stevie, as you said. But, it was a challenging film shoot to work on because the costumes and everything, it was meant to be such a grimy, dirty location, and so the costumes were just filthy, and we had to sit around in filth at the movie set for hours and hours waiting to film the part. So having not had much experience in the film industry with the classic hurry up and wait tagline, you're sitting in a costume in dirt until 5 a.m. That was it was probably about 10 minutes of filming and 40 hours of waiting.
But I'm sure it was a lot. I'm sure the sets were cleaner on Happy Hour and your cooking show later on, the Food Network show you did with Lisa Loeb. So
yeah, that was definitely required. It had to be a much more of a comfortable location.
Dweezil Zappa is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Straight ahead, we're going to talk about his post-80s and latest endeavors, as well as some of the mentoring and good things he's doing for young, aspiring musicians. Magic Fingers on Revenge of the 80s Radio. That's Dweezil Zappa's version from the CD Return of the Son of. You're listening to Revenge of the 80s Radio. Dweezil's on with us now. Currently, you're playing the 50 Years of Frank tour, as your father's Freak Out was released, I believe, 51 years ago.
Well, it was in 1966 that it came out, and we started this tour back in 2016. So it's gone to many different places, but we haven't hit Europe yet in a couple territories. So we're off to do that in about a week, and that will complete the 50 Years of Frank tour, and then we'll be off to another themed tour for next year.
A lot of guys, when they play albums that pay tribute to an artist or their family, they'll play some of the mainstream stuff, things that everybody knows. But last year, if I remember correctly, you played a lot of the very obscure stuff, and I'm pretty sure you're doing some of that this year. What are concert goers in Europe, when you head there, going to be hearing when you take the tour?
Well, the 50 Years of Frank tour really was mostly a chronological audio experience. We decided to make it represent the early era of my dad's career right from the beginning. So we did not play the entire Freak Out album, but we played a lot of material from that album as well as other things from the early days of the Mothers of Invention. So you did get a sense of the music progressing from 1966 on into the late 80s, and that was really kind of an exciting way to present the music, and we've expanded on that for what we're doing in Europe because we're adding some other songs that have never been played, well, not been played by my band, but also my dad didn't play them in this way because there's a song called Rollo, which has multiple different versions, and they came out in different ways over a period of time, but they never were all strung together so that you could hear each version and hear it side by side. And so that's one of the things we're doing on this tour, and it's really fun to play because it's complicated, but it's also fun, and the composition is just really intense. I mean, there's some difficult parts in it, but it's a really cool piece.
How often when you play these shows do you find young people there and getting into the music of Frank Zappa?
Well, when we started back in 2006, we didn't know if it was going to be something that we could do on an annual basis, and the majority of the people that we did see in the audience were mostly males in their late 50s through late 60s. But since we've been doing this for more than 10 years, we don't have an audience that's 70 and 80-year-olds. It's definitely a progressively younger audience because we've been exposing the music to a larger, younger audience for the past decade. So we do see a lot of teenagers and college-age kids that are getting into the music, and we see a lot more women, and it's definitely something that I've noticed a big change over the duration of the touring that I've done.
For younger people, it would be new music, if you will. It seems like you're being the ambassador of Zappa music to the new generation.
Well, my father's music was not exposed to a large audience on the radio, certainly not what is the bulk of his music. You know, some of his music got on the radio, but it's not the best representation of the totality of his musical output. So, for example, if you have only ever heard a song like Don't Eat the Yellow Snow, or Valley Girl, or Cosmic Debris, or Dancing Fool, songs like that have some sort of a comedic narrative, and they're almost like a little cartoon. So if that's what you think the music is based on that, you'd be highly misinformed. And my goal with Zappa Plays Zappa, when I originally started it and then had to change the name to just my name, Dweezil Zappa, plays whatever the Frank he wants. The goal has always been that I would present a very broad scope of my father's music, all his classical music, the avant-garde jazz things, as well as the rock. And I mean, he's got songs that have so many things in just one song. You might have gospel and blues, and then it might turn into something more avant-garde at some point. You know, there's a lot of textures that are involved in the instrumentation and orchestration. So that's the thing that I really wanted to bring to people, to show the depth and variety in the music, and his amazing skill as a composer orchestrator.
In a world where young people are being fed auto-tune music and a pop music industry trying to phase out guitar sounds and bring in more millennial whoops, I tend to believe it's important to bring music like this, more creative stuff to the younger generation. Really, they're starving for it because you can see the industry kind of splitting up a little bit. You have the pop industry, the radio-friendly industry, but there are a lot of young people really exploring the more independent style music and that's because they're starving for something different. And this is something, as I said before, very different for them as well.
Well, I think that there's always going to be cycles in music, and there's always been that kind of element of the very overproduced, branded, selective, let's get the youngest consumer involved kind of thing. But it is important to have depth and variety in what you eat and what you listen to. I mean, it is, if you only have one thing that you ever consume, it's not going to be the best outcome in the end.
Dweezil Zappa is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio, and you also developed your own sound. Or, I guess I really can't pigeonhole a sound for you, but one thing I can say is that you, like your father, listening to all your albums, 80s, post-80s, and today, never shied away from trying something different and innovative, to the degree that it would not only break the proverbial rules, but crumple them up and eat them and spit them out and stomp on them again, and then maybe rip them up into shreds and put whipped cream on them and eat them once again.
Well, I don't really look at it that way, but I do go ahead and follow things that are of interest to me. So the songs will take themselves in different directions. On the last record I did, which is called Via Zamata, there was a song that I did with the actor John Malkovich. He sent me some performance that he did of a spoken word version of Plato's allegory of the cave, and he said, why don't you just make music whatever you want and then put this on top of it. And so my challenge there was to turn it into something that would be have some sort of form, and it would ask questions and give you answers in the process. So it became a funny song where he's doing the allegory of the cave, and then the chorus is asking, what the F are you talking about? So it's Malkovich, what the F are you talking about? Because it sounds very confusing what he's talking about. And that the process of making that song was actually really fun, and the whole thing was done in about 8 hours in the studio, being composed to being finished and mixed.
Via Zamata, of course, the 2015 album, and that's where I say about breaking the proverbial rules. I mean, you keep the musicianship and the stellar musicianship, I might add, but where else, especially in Via Zamata, can you find a mix of rock, funk, swing, psychedelic, many forms of guitar from Slash to jazz, a kickback to your 80s sounds, spoken word, like you said, a little 90s, a little classical string mini ensemble sound, some pop sensibilities and select tracks, mariachi trumpeteering, and some storytelling. That's a lot of stuff. But it just fits right in.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of a journey, that record. I mean, I wanted to be able to use any kind of production style, any kind of instrumentation, and just have some fun in the studio because I hadn't made a record in a while. And I wasn't really going for trying to create one sound that was consistent from song to song. I was actually going for the opposite. I wanted to have a lot of variation from song to song. But so much of today's music is based on trying to have that consistency where if you have one sound, people feel like you're supposed to use it all the time, and every song sounds similar enough that you think, oh, well, this clearly must be that artist because they only have that sound. And it's limiting, I think, in so many ways. But it's that was definitely something I wanted to avoid on my record.
Well, you said Malkovich was done in about 8 hours. In contrast, upon hearing Dinosaur earlier this year, I was thinking, how's your What the Hell Was I Thinking project coming along?
That's a record that I started in the 90s, and it's something that I would love to be able to finish at some point soon in the coming years, but it's the whole concept behind that just sort of changed as I was going with it. It started as something that was going to be 22 minutes long, and it was just a random selection of time. But I wanted to have a lot of different kinds of music in that 22 minutes, and I invited some friends of mine to play guitar on it. And when I completed that 22-minute section, I thought, well, what would be really interesting is if I made a record that was the entire length of a CD, which is 75 minutes is the maximum amount of time you can put on the CD. So I decided it would turn into a 75-minute instrumental that is constantly segueing and turning into different styles of music, like an audio movie. So it's just morphing, and you hear different guitar players that start spilling out of the speakers. And there's about 40 different people that have been recorded on it. People like Brian May from Queen, Angus and Malcolm Young from AC/DC, Edward Van Halen, Steve Vai, Eric Johnson, Brian Setzer from the Stray Cats. I mean, there's all kinds of different sounds that start coming out of the speakers. And I haven't had a chance to work on it in a while because I've been doing so much touring, playing my dad's music. But I will get back to it and finish it up and turn it into the ultimate version of what I intended from the beginning. The good thing is I've been able to allow myself to keep re-envisioning the project and improving upon it.
Sort of your magnum opus, if you will.
I guess.
And Dweezil, in addition to writing, playing, and producing music, you teach budding youngsters through your Dwezilla music boot camps. It's a place for real musical instruction. This is not like a fantasy camp, but it's very serious, intense instruction.
Well, it's actually called Dwezilla, and we do change the format each time, but the real goal is to be able to give people a chance to be exposed to multiple different concepts that can help them expand more quickly. So sometimes it's a very guitar-centric camp, and other times we do it where we have the whole band teaching, so you can learn drums, bass, keyboards, saxophone, different stuff. But ultimately the goal is always to be exposed to musical concepts that are exciting and creative, that can break down barriers and open up new doors for creativity. And as it relates to guitar, I definitely have a few methods that I teach that are almost instantaneous in terms of people wanting to be able to see the neck and utilize notes on the neck right away. There so many times people get stuck in a box on the guitar, just mainly because of the way that it's typically taught. But there's just a visual shift that I teach people, and I break it down into simple things. Like, instead of thinking of it as 6 strings, I say, let's think about it as 3 sets of 2 strings, because the stuff you can do on one set of 2 strings, you can do on the other sets of 2 strings, and it's identical. The guitar is set up in mirror images. So it's when I show it to people, it makes perfect sense right away, and they're able to have much more fun more quickly, especially if they're a beginner, because they can start moving around laterally on the neck.
Dwezilla, my bad. That's the proper pronunciation. I really have to make the fonts bigger when I start reading again. Also, Dweezil, we have talked with a fellow who has done some good things for at-risk youth in Washington, D.C. and around the world, guitarist Gregory Hammond. He's a good fellow, and you've helped his Global Jam for Peace Foundation bring musical instruments to young people who would not otherwise be able to access them.
Well, Gregory has come to shows, and he's been to the Dwezilla camp, and he's brought students from his other organization, Guitars Not Guns, and his whole reason for getting into these kind of programs was because he had a frightening experience of being attacked by a youth who really didn't have anything else to keep them occupied, so they're out there doing crime. And he turned that experience into a teaching experience and a charitable experience, and as it related to guitars and music, it seemed like something that I'd be happy to help with, and I've been able to talk about it, and I think it's one of those things that more people should be aware of and get involved in. Trying to give people an outlet, a creative outlet, as opposed to idle time without supervision. When you have that going on in too many places, kids can find themselves in trouble. But music is a great outlet, and it's guitar can keep you busy for a while.
This can be life-changing for a lot of these kids. Greg's told me some of his group success stories, including his own.
Well, it certainly can. I mean, I know that from my own experience of playing guitar since I was 12, it's filled with its own adventures. You can constantly be learning new things and be excited about it. So for me, it seemed an obvious thing to want to contribute to what he was doing, because I can share that excitement and enthusiasm for the guitar, and in doing that, it provides something to keep somebody occupied and make them do something positive, as opposed to getting involved in negative things.
Dweezil, you have a very special event coming at the end of this year featuring some of your classical pieces.
I'm doing a thing in Holland at the end of this year where I'm premiering some of my own orchestral music. It's an evening that's called Dweezil Zappa's Orchestral Favorites. I'm playing some of my own music. We're doing a piece by Steve Vai, and we're doing some of my father's music, and it's with the Dutch National Orchestra. So it's happening just after Thanksgiving this year, and I'm going to be world premiering and recording some of my own classical works.
Dweezil Zappa, thank you again for joining us here on Revenge of the 80s Radio.
Thank you.
And to find out more about what Dweezil's doing soon, what he's been doing, and what he'll do in the future, check out his website, DweezilZappa.com. That's DweezilZappa.com. Let's play a track from Via Zamata, Dweezil. This one, Dragon Master on Revenge of the 80s Radio.